I think what really was going on is that Hogan was putting a lot of pressure on Vince to take the belt and take it off me and put it on him. Otherwise, he was going to go to WCW. So I think it was our last. Vince just pulled the plug on me, like everything he said, everything he promised me and said to me didn't matter. Just unplugged that and put in Hulk Hogan again.
The truth is, King of the Ring 1993 gave Bret Hart the single greatest night of his entire career. 3 matches in one evening, 3 completely different opponents, 3 victories, a crown, a scepter, and a crowd in Dayton, Ohio that knew, deep in its bones, that it had just watched something rare, something historic, something that would be talked about for decades. That was the beautiful version of the story. That was the version the company wanted every single fan to walk away believing. But the full story is far darker and far messier than that fairy tale. Because while Bret was out there carrying the entire show on his shoulders, a war was playing out behind the curtain that most fans never got the full picture on. If this is already pulling you in, hit that hype button right now and give this video some hype. It helps this channel more than you know, and it tells us you want more stories like this one. Every single one of you matters. Now let us get into it, because this one goes very deep and there is a lot to unpack. So how did a tournament built to crown a new hero turn into a corporate divorce that buried an entire era on the way out? How did the night meant to launch the new generation end with a fake exploding camera, a press conference in Tokyo, and the ugliest exit in WWF history? To answer that, you have to start 2 months before King of the Ring, at a show in Las Vegas that most wrestling fans have spent years trying to forget. By early 1993, the World Wrestling Federation was in genuine crisis. Ratings were falling. Live attendance had dropped to some of the lowest numbers the company had ever recorded. A federal investigation into steroid distribution, led by the United States Attorney for the Eastern District of New York, was threatening to send Vince McMahon himself to prison for nearly a decade. That is not an exaggeration. His entire company, everything he had built, was at risk, and the product itself was out of step with where culture was heading. The 1980s had been built on massive, cartoonish muscle men in bright colors with simple hero and villain stories. That formula had made the WWF a global phenomenon. But by 1993, it was a cage. The audience wanted something more athletic, more real, more honest. They wanted performers who could actually wrestle. Bret Hart was that performer. He was ready. He was polished. He was the most technically gifted wrestler on the entire roster and arguably the best in the world at that moment. He was the future that Vince McMahon needed. But there was one enormous problem sitting directly in his path, and that problem was wearing a red and yellow bandana. Hulk Hogan was not ready to step aside. Not for Bret, not for anyone. WrestleMania the 9th was held on April the 4th, 1993, at Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas. The plan for that evening was clean and sensible. Yokozuna would defeat Bret Hart for the WWF Championship, setting up Bret as the scrappy challenger chasing the dominant villain. It would build momentum. It would give the new generation a clear direction. It made sense creatively, and it made sense for business. Then Hulk Hogan walked through the curtain and tore the whole thing to pieces. After Yokozuna won the belt through interference by Mr. Fuji, who threw salt into Bret's eyes, Hogan appeared at ringside. He had not been scheduled to compete that night at all. He was supposedly there in a support role, but Mr. Fuji issued an immediate challenge on the spot, and Hogan accepted. 22 seconds later, Hogan pinned Yokozuna and walked away with his 5th WWF championship. The locker room was completely stunned. The Undertaker was furious. Shawn Michaels shook his head in disbelief. Months of patient storytelling had been wiped out in under half a minute to satisfy the ego of one man who refused to let someone else step into his spotlight. What made it worse was the promise that came after. According to multiple accounts from the era, Vince McMahon brokered a deal with Bret to smooth things over. Hogan would hold the title through the spring and then pass it to Bret at SummerSlam 1993 in a match that would serve as the definitive torch pass. The company even started building toward it publicly. The June 1993 issue of WWF magazine began teasing the Hogan versus Bret showdown. A promotional photograph was taken of the two men pulling the championship belt between them in a tug-of-war pose. That image ran in publications and on promotional material. The match looked real. it looked confirmed, and then it quietly disappeared. Hogan later claimed he was never aware of any definitive promise made to Bret. He said the WrestleMania finish was McMahon's decision entirely. But the marketing told a completely different story. Nobody prints a tug-of-war promotional photo and teases a SummerSlam dream match unless there is a plan in place. Something killed that plan, and the man with the most leverage to kill it was the one holding the belt and refusing to drop it to a smaller opponent. This was the bind McMahon had created for himself. He needed Hogan because the steroid trial was coming, the bad press was escalating, and Hogan still carried mainstream name recognition that could help the company weather the storm. But Hogan was using that exact leverage as a weapon against the company's future. According to Bret Hart's autobiography and numerous shoot interviews throughout the years, Hogan told McMahon point blank that Bret was not in his league and was not a draw. He reportedly referred to Bret and other smaller wrestlers as midgets who were not capable of carrying a world championship. This was pure 1980s territorial thinking, size over skill, muscles over matches. It was a philosophy the world had already left behind, but Hogan was still living inside it and forcing everyone else to live there too. McMahon was out of options. Hogan had no genuine interest in the long-term health of the company. He was already having conversations about Hollywood projects. He was already looking at Japan. His focus was entirely on protecting his personal Hulkamania brand and lining up his next move. McMahon finally made the call. He was getting the championship off Hogan at King of the Ring. No more delays. No more compromises on the SummerSlam plan. The belt was changing hands in Dayton, and that was final. The original plan for how Hogan would lose was actually crafted specifically to protect him. The idea involved bringing in a heel Japanese referee who would cheat Hogan out of the title, making sure Hulkamania looked invincible even in defeat. Hogan even personally reached out to a well-known referee named Masao Tiger Hattori to come in for the spot. But Hattori was under contract with New Japan Pro Wrestling, and the deal collapsed just 1 week before the pay-per-view. 1 week out, the company had no finish and a champion who refused to lose clean. What they put together in place of that original idea became one of the most ridiculed moments in the entire history of professional wrestling. During the WWF Championship match, a man posing as a Japanese photographer, who was actually Harvey Whippleman, walked down to ringside and aimed his camera at Hogan. The camera exploded. Smoke and debris flew through the air. Hogan dropped to the mat and feigned total blindness. Yokozuna hit the leg drop and won the title. Hogan had refused to lose cleanly to a 500-pound man on a major pay-per-view, so the company invented a supernatural exploding camera to get the belt off him. That was the compromise. That is what one man's refusal to put business over ego actually looked like in practice. It was absurd, it was embarrassing, and every person watching at home could feel that something had gone wrong. Meanwhile, in a completely different corner of the same event, something brilliant was happening. Bret Hart was putting on a performance that nobody in that business had a right to deliver. He had been given the #1 seed in the King of the Ring tournament, partly as compensation for what had been stolen from him at WrestleMania. He had received a bye through the qualifying rounds, and on this night, he had to win 3 separate matches against 3 completely different opponents to be crowned king. Pat Patterson had given him a specific directive going into the night. Do not use a sharpshooter. Win without your signature move. Prove to the whole world that you can win any way, on any night, against anyone. Bret took that challenge and ran with it. To truly appreciate what Bret accomplished that night, you have to hear those 3 matches in reverse order. Because the further back you trace his path, the more you understand exactly how impossible the whole thing was. Number 3 on Bret's road to the crown was Bam Bam Bigelow in the final. Bret had already wrestled close to 30 minutes of hard technical action by this point. His body was feeling every second of it. Bigelow, on the other hand, had received a bye into the finals after a time-limit draw between Lex Luger and Tatanka, so he was completely rested and ready. He used every bit of that advantage. He attacked Bret's back systematically with bear hugs and backbreakers, punishing a man who was already running on pure will. Luna Vachon got involved and nearly cost Bret the match with outside interference, creating a false finish that had the crowd genuinely unsure of the outcome. But Bret found one final burst of brilliance. catching Bigelow with a victory roll out of nowhere for the pin. A king crowned through nothing but guts and heart. Number 2 was Mr. Perfect in the semifinal, and this was the match of the entire night by a wide margin. It is widely considered among the best King of the Ring matches ever held and one of the finest bouts of the entire 1993 calendar year. It was a rare face-versus-face encounter built entirely on technical wrestling, with both men drawing on a shared history that included a legendary classic at SummerSlam in 1991. Perfect took a subtly heelish approach, using the ring ropes to send Bret crashing knee first to the floor below. That knee became the central story for 19 minutes of counters, reversals, near falls, and high-impact wrestling that had the crowd completely locked in from bell to bell. Bret finally reversed a small package to get the 3 count. 19 minutes of wrestling that could have headlined any arena in any city in the world. Number 1 was Razor Ramon in the quarterfinal, the opening bout of Bret's marathon and still not a throwaway match by any stretch. Ramon used his size and power throughout, targeting Bret's hands and shoulders specifically to strip away his technical base. The match was built on a clear story that anyone could follow. Then came the finish that said everything about who Bret Hart was. Ramon attempted a back suplex from the second rope. Bret shifted his weight in midair. He came down on top of Ramon and got the 3 count. Superior leverage, perfect timing, the excellence of execution living up to every word of that name. 3 opponents, 3 different styles, 3 different finishing moves, all of it without once using the sharpshooter. It was a masterclass in what the very best professional wrestling can look like when the right person is given the time and the space to show their full range. But here is the part that leaves a sour taste even today. After all of that, after 3 of the most grueling matches he had ever fought in a single evening, Bret Hart was handed a cardboard crown and a cheap scepter. Not the WWF Championship, not the belt he had been promised. While Bret was being coronated with a prop, the real prize was sitting on the waist of a man who had just lost it through a fake exploding camera finish. The king had no kingdom. The best performer on the show that night walked away with the least valuable prize on the table. And then Hogan made everything worse. Shortly after King of the Ring, still technically under WWF contract, he flew to Japan to work for New Japan Pro Wrestling. At a press conference in Tokyo, he held up the WWF Championship belt and called it a toy and a trinket. He told the Japanese press that the only championship that truly mattered was the IWGP heavyweight title, the company that had made him the most recognizable name in the sport, the fans who had cheered for him for an entire decade. All of it dismissed in a single sentence. McMahon was reportedly furious beyond words. The partnership was over. Hogan would not appear on WWF television for nearly 9 years. And when he did resurface in professional wrestling, it was in WCW, where his Hulkamania brand helped fuel the Monday Night Wars that pushed the WWF to the absolute edge of survival. McMahon was left to piece together a promotion that had lost its biggest name, damaged its title's credibility, and still had a federal courtroom waiting for it. The solution he chose made things worse before they got better. He built Lex Luger as the new patriotic hero, launching the Lex Express on July the 4th, 1993, with Luger body-slamming Yokozuna aboard the USS Intrepid. Luger toured America on a bus. He waved the flag. He had the physique and the look. He was everything Hogan had been in 1985, and the fans simply refused to accept it. The truth was that McMahon was repeating the exact same mistake. He was looking for a muscular flag waver when the person the audience had already chosen was standing right there in front of him. Bret Hart had proven himself at King of the Ring in the most complete way imaginable. The fans knew it, the locker room knew it, but McMahon was still trying to find his next Hogan instead of accepting that the next era looked nothing like the last one. Bret was not even allowed to chase the title he deserved. At his own coronation ceremony, Jerry Lawler ran down to the ring and attacked him, starting a feud built around Lawler's claim that there could only be one king in the WWF. It was entertaining television, nobody is denying that, but it was also a deliberate tactic to keep Bret tied up in a mid-card rivalry while the company rolled the dice on Luger. Bret has spoken openly about the frustration of that period. He felt he had carried the company on his back through the worst of the steroid scandal, through the instability and the bad press, only to be handed a sideshow feud while bigger men collected the push. That feeling of being undervalued, of loyalty that only ran one direction, planted a seed that would grow into something far more destructive 4 years down the road at a pay-per-view in Montreal. The Luger experiment failed completely. By WrestleMania 10 in 1994, the company was forced to do what it should have done a full year earlier. Bret Hart got his championship reign. He got his proper place at the top of the card. He got the run that had been promised and then taken from him twice. It was overdue, but it happened. And that is ultimately what King of the Ring 1993 was. The Hulkamania era did not end with a torch pass. It ended with a middle finger. But the new generation did eventually get its chance. Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels, and the performers around them carried the company through its darkest stretch. They built something real, and the foundation for all of it was laid on June the 13th, 1993, in a building in Dayton where one man put on 3 of the greatest consecutive matches of his career and walked out wearing a cardboard crown. King of the Ring 1993 was messy, but it was necessary. And now you know the full story. Drop a comment below and tell us what you think Bret deserved that night. Like the video, subscribe for more stories like this, and we will see you in the next one. They lied about this. Nearly 30 years have passed since that night in Montreal, and the official version of events still does not hold up. The truth behind Survivor Series 1997 is darker, more deliberate, and more human than any official account has ever been willing to fully admit. The Molson Center was electric. 20,000 people filled that arena expecting to watch a legendary championship match. Bret Hart was defending the WWF Championship against Shawn Michaels. The energy was genuine. Both men were at the very peak of their abilities. The crowd came ready for history. Before we go any further, if this story already has you hooked, go ahead and give this video some hype. That one tap helps the channel more than you might realize. But behind that spectacle, a very different reality was already in motion. Secret meetings had been held in the days leading up to the show. A legal contract worth millions had been deliberately cast aside. A referee had been kept out of the loop until the very last possible moment, and then threatened with the end of his career if he did not cooperate. An entire locker room of wrestlers was hours away from walking out on the company. None of this was part of any storyline. None of it was fiction. What happened in Montreal was real. The consequences were immediate and lasting. This is what they never told you. To understand why Montreal happened, you have to look at the bigger picture first. By late 1997, the WWF was losing the Monday Night War against World Championship Wrestling, also known as WCW. Week after week, WCW was outperforming the WWF in television ratings and merchandise sales. The pressure at the top of the WWF was extreme. Vince McMahon was watching his company fall behind, and that fear drove him toward decisions that would end his longest and most loyal professional relationship. In October 1996, Bret Hart had turned down a $9 million 3-year offer from WCW. That was significant money. Bret walked away from it. Instead, he signed what was described as a 20-year lifetime contract with the WWF. The deal paid him approximately $1.5 million per year for the first 3 years as an active performer, with the remaining 17 years transitioning into a management and booking capacity after he retired from in-ring work. For Bret, this contract meant everything. It was security. It was a commitment from the company he had given his career to. For Vince McMahon, it was a defensive move to stop his best performer from joining the opposition during the peak of the New World Order's popularity. Less than a year later, the promise began to crumble. By mid-1997, McMahon was privately telling Bret that the company was in financial peril. Then on September 22, 1997, during a Monday Night Raw taping at Madison Square Garden, McMahon told Bret directly that the WWF intended to breach the contract. He said the company was financially dying and pushed Bret to reopen negotiations with WCW. That was the official justification for everything that followed. But that justification does not survive scrutiny. Within months of claiming the company could not afford Bret's $1.5 million annual salary, McMahon signed Mike Tyson to a deal worth millions for a small number of non-wrestling appearances. You cannot claim financial ruin and then spend that kind of money on celebrity appearances. The truth appears to be something more calculated. Bret Hart was no longer the kind of performer the WWF wanted at the center of its product. The company was shifting toward a rougher and more controversial direction, and Bret did not fit that vision. By engineering a situation where Bret felt pushed out, McMahon could eliminate a major salary commitment while making it look as though Bret had chosen to leave. It was a calculated removal, not a financial crisis. The corporate betrayal had a personal engine powering it. The hatred between Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels was not a storyline. It was real, and by 1997 it had gone well beyond professional rivalry into something genuinely destructive. The key moment came on May 19, 1997, during a live episode of Wwe'S War. Shawn Michaels delivered a promo that crossed every professional and personal line imaginable. He implied on national television that Bret Hart, a married man, was having a real-life affair with a fellow WWE personality named Tammy Lynn Sitch, widely known by her ring name, Sunny. This was not scripted. Michaels made that choice himself, using a live broadcast to damage Bret's marriage and his reputation in front of millions of viewers. It made clear that Michaels felt completely protected inside the company and was willing to use that protection in the most damaging way he could. The consequences came fast. On June 9, 1997, at the Hartford Civic Center, Bret Hart confronted Michaels in the locker room. The confrontation turned physical. Hart attacked Michaels for real, and during the brawl pulled a significant chunk of Michaels' hair out at the roots. Michaels walked away from the fight holding his own hair and screamed at Vince McMahon that the WWF was an unsafe work environment. He threatened to quit. He used a phrase that became notorious in the industry, saying he would lose his smile, which became shorthand for Michaels refusing to honor his professional commitments. No formal action was taken against Michaels inside the company. No discipline, no real consequence. The message that sent to Bret Hart was loud and impossible to misread. Michaels was protected, and Bret was not. By the time the roster arrived in Montreal for Survivor Series, the two men had not spoken to each other in months. Michaels told Bret directly that he would never return the favor of dropping a match to him. That statement was the trigger for Bret to invoke the reasonable creative control clause in his contract, a provision covering the last 30 days of any program. Bret made his position clear. He would drop the WWF Championship to anyone, anywhere, under any conditions. He would not lose to Shawn Michaels in Canada. That position was contractually supported, and it became the stated justification for the decision that followed. The commonly repeated version of the Montreal Screwjob presents it as a sudden move, a desperate call made at the last minute by a promoter with no other options. That version is not accurate. What actually took place was structured, deliberate, and carefully kept away from almost everyone who might have interfered with it. The serious planning started the Saturday evening before the pay-per-view. A meeting was held on the second floor of the Montreal Marriott. Vince McMahon, Shawn Michaels, Jim Ross, Jim Cornette, and Pat Patterson were all present. The discussion covered Hart's refusal to lose the title to Michaels in Canada. Patterson was there for the general conversation. But there is a critical detail here. Michaels and Bruce Pritchard have since confirmed that Patterson was deliberately excluded from the final plan. The reason was that Patterson had a deep and almost parental affection for Bret Hart. If he had known what was truly being arranged, he would almost certainly have warned Bret. After the larger meeting concluded, McMahon asked a smaller group to remain behind. That group was Shawn Michaels, Triple H, and Jerry Briscoe. Inside that smaller circle, the actual mechanics of the betrayal were worked out. Triple H, who had not yet reached the main event level he would later occupy, pushed things forward decisively. He reportedly told McMahon that if Bret would not do business, they should do it for him. That one statement ended any remaining attempt to find a finish both sides had agreed to, and locked in the plan for a deliberate double-cross. The most sensitive piece of the entire operation was the referee. Earl Hebner was not just any official. He had a long and genuine friendship with Bret Hart. Bret had personally asked for Hebner to referee the match because he trusted him completely. In Bret's mind, having Hebner there was a safeguard against exactly this kind of situation. That trust was the precise reason the conspirators had to keep Hebner uninformed for as long as possible. If Hebner had been told even a day earlier, his friendship with Brett might have led him to warn Hart and collapse the entire plan. Hebner was informed about what was going to happen as Bret Hart was literally walking through the entrance curtain to the ring. McMahon and several agents surrounded him and explained exactly how the finish would work. Hebner was reminded that he was wearing a small microphone behind his ear, which allowed the production team to monitor him throughout the match. And he was told directly that if he did not call for the bell the moment Michaels applied the sharpshooter, he would be fired before he even made it back to the locker room. Hebner was not a willing participant. He was a man placed in an impossible position at the very last moment, with his entire career on the line and no time to think. He chose corporate compliance over personal loyalty. The plan moved forward. For 12 minutes, the match looked like everything it had been promoted as. Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels worked through a technically structured layout, both men performing professionally despite everything between them outside the ring. The prearranged finish was a disqualification. Bret was supposed to keep the title that night and give it up voluntarily on Raw the following evening. That was the agreement Bret was working toward. Then the agreement was thrown out. Michaels applied the sharpshooter, which was Bret Hart's own signature submission hold. Bret began reaching to reverse the move, which was the planned next step. At that moment, Vince McMahon, who had left his broadcast position to stand at ringside, began screaming at the timekeeper to ring the bell. Earl Hebner immediately signaled for the bell. Shawn Michaels' music began. Bret Hart had never submitted. He had never tapped. The whole thing was a fabrication. The aftermath was not scripted. Bret stood in the ring and understood in real time exactly what had just been done to him. He looked directly at McMahon and spat at him. He stayed in the ring and smashed expensive production equipment. He traced the letters WCW in the air with his finger. He was not performing at all. He was a man with nothing left but one final statement. The crowd, slowly grasping what they had witnessed, began reacting to something that felt genuinely wrong. The violence did not stop at ringside. After the match, The Undertaker made clear to McMahon that he needed to go and face Bret personally. McMahon eventually entered Bret's dressing room to explain himself. Whatever words were exchanged, the conversation ended fast. Bret delivered one uppercut. McMahon was knocked off his feet and unconscious. He was out cold for approximately 5 minutes, sustained a black eye and a concussion. Bret broke his own hand in the process. He later described that punch as the sweetest thing he ever did. It was the only response left available to a man who had given 2 decades to a company that had just publicly destroyed him. The locker room in the days following Survivor Series was close to complete breakdown. The Undertaker led conversations about a full walkout. The feeling among the wrestlers was direct and logical. If McMahon was willing to do this to Bret Hart, a man who had been the face of the company for years and had passed up better money to stay loyal, then no one was protected. Every contract was just paper. The trust that holds a locker room together had been deliberately destroyed in full view of everyone inside the company, and people felt the impact immediately. The most dramatic and visible protest came from Rick Rude. Rude had been working for the WWF on a short-term arrangement and had been backstage in Montreal to witness the aftermath. Disgusted by what he had seen, he contacted WCW and left immediately. On November 17, 1997, Rude did something that had genuinely never happened before. He appeared live on WCW Monday Nitro, clean-shaven, cutting a promo that called the WWF a sinking ship and described Shawn Michaels as holding a championship only because it had been stolen. 1 hour later, viewers who switched over to WWF Raw saw a fully bearded Rick Rude in a pre-taped segment working as a bodyguard for D-Generation X. The same man on both shows in the same night. It was the single most visible and public symbol of the institutional collapse happening inside the WWF. Mick Foley went further than everyone else. While multiple wrestlers discussed walking out, Foley was the only one who actually did it in the immediate aftermath. He refused to appear at the Raw taping in Ottawa the following night. He sat alone in his hotel room. He would later say that he discovered that night that one really is the loneliest number, because he was the only one who followed through when it actually came to it. He eventually returned due to his contract, but his absence showed exactly how deep the moral divide had become. The Hart family members still under contract paid a different kind of price. Owen Hart asked McMahon for his release so he could join Bret in WCW. McMahon refused. Davey Boy Smith paid $100,000 to buy out his own contract and leave. Owen could not afford the buyout, so he was trapped. His career was quietly steered away from the main event. After a brief push as a revenge-seeking figure called the Black Heart, he was moved into the Blue Blazer character, a comedic, bumbling superhero gimmick that many felt was a deliberate effort to strip the Hart name of its prestige. Jim Neidhart was held by the company until WCW was ready to bring him in. During that time, he was put in a D-Generation X storyline that ended on his final night with Michael spray painting the letters WCW across his back in black paint and leaving him handcuffed to the ropes for the audience to watch. That was not a wrestling angle. It was an act of deliberate humiliation aimed at a man who was a surrogate for the person McMahon could no longer get to. WWE documentaries have spent years pushing the line that Bret screwed Bret. The argument is that Hart's refusal to drop the title left McMahon no real alternative. But the evidence does not support that. A company genuinely too broke to honor a contract does not sign a global celebrity for millions of dollars a few weeks later. A plan that was carefully structured in secret, that deliberately cut out anyone who might protect the target, is not a desperate last resort. It is a premeditated action dressed up after the fact as necessity. Montreal was the moment kayfabe truly died. Kayfabe is the unwritten industry code that kept the business of wrestling separate from the performance of wrestling. It protected performers. It preserved mutual trust. It maintained the agreement between the people inside the system. On November 9th, 1997, that code was demolished in front of a live audience and millions watching at home. Not bent, not tested, demolished. The Mr. McMahon character was born from that night. The villainous authority figure who defined the Attitude Era and drove the company to financial success grew directly out of what happened in Montreal. The WWF eventually won the Monday Night War. Revenue eventually grew. By almost any financial measure, the gamble paid off. And for a long time, that is exactly how the official record read. But it paid off at a genuine cost. Bret Hart spent 20 years building the thing that then turned around and used his loyalty as a weapon against him. The reason Montreal still matters, nearly 3 decades later, is not just because it was a shocking moment. It matters because it tells a truth about how power actually works. Loyalty does not guarantee protection. Promises do not always hold when the bottom line shifts. That truth does not go away just because the business moved on. And if this video gave you something real, make sure you are subscribed. There is a lot more of this kind of story coming.
I don't know what the original intent for the design of that thing, but it really wasn't designed for any sport. I mean, unless maybe it was gladiators.
That's what it looks like.
The truth is, WrestleMania was supposed to be something to be proud of. Every year, it was the biggest night in wrestling, a celebration, a spectacle, something that made fans feel like they were watching history. WrestleMania 7 on March 24th, 1991, should have been no different. The stage was set. The country was buzzing. The WWF had a massive patriotic story in place, and Vince McMahon had been promising something historic for over a year. This was going to be the show that topped everything. Over 100,000 fans inside the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum. A record breaker, a landmark. That was the dream. Fathers planned to bring their sons. Fans drove across state lines. People bought their tickets early because they believed Vince when he said this would be the greatest WrestleMania ever staged. The energy was real. The anticipation was genuine. The hope was completely earned. But if you were actually there, or if you have ever looked past the official story, you already know things did not go the way Vince promised. And the truth behind why things went so wrong is darker than most people realize. If you are into deep wrestling stories like this one, Hit the hype feature and give this video some hype. It really does help, and it keeps content like this coming. Now, to understand why WrestleMania 7 became a disaster, you have to understand what the WWF was dealing with heading into 1991. The golden era of the 1980s had been incredible. Hulk Hogan, larger-than-life characters, sold out arenas everywhere. But by 1990, the shine was fading. Audiences had seen the same formula over and over. The cartoon heroes and villains were getting stale. Buy rates were softening. The WWF needed something bold, something that would light a fire under a cooling product. Vince McMahon decided to reach outside the world of wrestling entirely and grab hold of the biggest news story on the planet. In August of 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait. The world held its breath. American troops were deployed. Operation Desert Storm was coming. The Gulf War was not background noise. It was front-page news every single day. Families had sons and daughters overseas. Real fear, real stakes, real lives on the line. And Vince McMahon looked at all of that and saw a marketing opportunity. The plan was to build WrestleMania 7 around a patriotic theme called Superstars in Stripes Forever. America versus the enemy, good versus evil, hero versus traitor. On paper, you can almost understand the thinking. Wrestling had always used real-world tensions as inspiration. But what Vince did next crossed a line that should never have been crossed. He turned Sergeant Slaughter into an Iraqi sympathizer. Robert Remus had spent years building the Sergeant Slaughter character into one of the most beloved figures in wrestling. He was a Marine icon, a G.I. Joe character, literally. Kids grew up watching him as the all-American hero. He was the kind of figure parents actually liked their children admiring. To an entire generation, Slaughter meant patriotism, discipline, and pride. Vince pitched a complete reversal. Slaughter would return to the WWF not as a hero, but as a turncoat, a man who had abandoned American values, someone who now aligned himself with Iraqi brutality. The character argued that America had grown soft and weak. As the Gulf War escalated, the gimmick escalated with it. Slaughter began appearing in Arab-style headdresses. He adopted the camel clutch as his finishing move, a hold associated with the Iranian Iron Sheik. He was presented as being directly linked to Saddam Hussein. There were segments where Slaughter sang "Happy Birthday" to a portrait of Saddam and asked the crowd for silence to honor the dictator. The creative team called what they were chasing nuclear heat, the most intense, visceral crowd reaction possible. And they got it, but not in the way they expected. Using an active war, one where American service members were being deployed, fighting, and dying, as a backdrop for a scripted wrestling storyline, was not edgy storytelling. It was exploitation. There is no softer word for it. Real families were living through real fear, and the WWF was packaging that fear as entertainment to sell pay-per-view buys. The mainstream media noticed. Bob Costas, one of the most respected sports broadcasters in the country, had originally been lined up to participate in the event. When the Iraqi sympathizer angle grew more aggressive, Costas pulled out. He refused to be connected to a product that used a lethal international crisis for profit. That was a significant moment. The WWF had spent years trying to build mainstream credibility, and now one of the most trusted voices in sports broadcasting wanted nothing to do with them. But the exploitation of the war angle was only part of the story. The bigger scandal was happening behind the scenes, in the ticket office, and it would lead to one of the most elaborate cover-ups in wrestling history. For months, Vince McMahon had been making a very specific promise. WrestleMania 7 would take place at the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum, a stadium with a capacity of over 100,000 people. Vince had even filmed promotional material a year in advance, personally guaranteeing a historic sellout. This was going to shatter the attendance record set at WrestleMania 3. It was going to prove that the WWF was bigger than ever. Then a few weeks before the show, the WWF announced that the event was moving, not to a different city, not to a larger venue, to the Los Angeles Memorial Sports Arena, right next door to the Coliseum, a building that held around 16,000 people. The official reason, broadcast on television and released to the press, was security. The WWF claimed that terrorist threats against Sergeant Slaughter made the open-air Coliseum too dangerous. They said they were moving the show to protect the fans. Patriotic duty, safety first. That was a lie. The Wrestling Observer newsletter, the most trusted source in the wrestling industry at the time, reported that roughly 6 weeks before the show, the WWF had sold somewhere between 11,900 and 15,000 tickets for a stadium built for over 100,000 people. That means the Coliseum would have been close to 90% empty on the biggest night of the wrestling year. Pay-per-view cameras would have captured tens of thousands of vacant seats, broadcast into the homes of every fan who had bought the show. The image alone would have been catastrophic. It would have told the entire world that the WWF was not the unstoppable juggernaut Vince had been selling. Security costs for an outdoor stadium of that size were estimated between $3 and $4 million, money the company could not justify given how badly the tickets were selling. By moving to the sports arena, the WWF could claim a sellout. They still had to paper the crowd with complimentary tickets just to fill the smaller building. But at least the cameras would not show row after row of empty seats. The terrorist threat story was a fabricated cover designed to mask a box office collapse. And Vince McMahon told that story on national television. Now here is where it gets harder to separate the business decision from the human cost. Because even though the venue move was driven by money and optics, the danger that Robert Remus lived through every single day was absolutely real. The nuclear heat the creative team had been chasing did not stay inside the arena. Remus began receiving credible death threats daily, not occasional letters, not vague online anger, daily threats, bomb threats. The FBI got involved in planning his travel and his appearances at arenas. He was advised to wear a bulletproof vest under his gear during matches and under his regular clothes in public. His home was placed under 24-hour armed security. Before every show, FBI agents swept the arenas for threats. He could not just drive to work and do his job. Every appearance was a federal security operation. And then it came home. His children were being harassed at school. Kids whose father was just doing his job, playing a character on television, were being targeted because of a gimmick Vince McMahon had created. Remus had to personally visit his children's school and explain to other children that he was an actor, that the character on television was not real, that their dad was not actually a traitor. Think about that. A man had to explain kayfabe to a classroom of kids to protect his family. The WWF had manufactured a situation so intense, so deliberately designed to blur the line between fiction and reality, that a real human being needed the FBI just to get through his work week. And none of that was an accident. The creative team knew exactly what kind of fire they were playing with. They just decided the heat was worth it. There is one more layer to this that makes the entire thing even more uncomfortable. Reporting that came out later revealed that Robert Remus had never actually served in the United States military. The character of Sergeant Slaughter, the Marine hero, the G.I. Joe icon, was built on a background that did not exist. Veterans groups and military families were already outraged at a man portraying a traitor during an active war. When the news spread that he had never served at all, the anger deepened. The gimmick was not just exploitative. It was built from the ground up on a fiction. But in the middle of all of this, something genuinely extraordinary happened. Something that had nothing to do with wars or gimmicks or ticket sales. Something that reminded everyone watching why professional wrestling, at its best, is unlike anything else in the world. Randy Savage versus the Ultimate Warrior in a career-ending match. This match is considered by many historians to be one of the greatest ever performed. The psychology was exceptional. Savage, playing an arrogant and desperate character, threw everything he had at the Warrior. He hit 5 consecutive top rope elbow drops. 5. A single elbow drop ends most matches. 5 should have ended any match in history. When the Warrior kicked out, the arena did not just react, it broke. The crowd went on a genuine emotional journey, pulled along by 2 performers who understood exactly what they were doing and why it mattered. Then came the moment that people still talk about today. After the match, Savage had lost. His career was supposed to be over. His manager, Queen Sherry, attacked him, furious at the defeat. And then, from somewhere in the crowd, Miss Elizabeth climbed over the railing. She had been sitting there the whole time, watching. And when she saw Savage being attacked, she could not stay away. She pushed Sherry back and stood over Randy. The fans recognized what they were seeing. Years of history, a love story that had played out in front of them, a reunion that nobody had asked for, but everyone had been hoping for. People were in tears, genuinely in tears, inside an arena that had just spent hours watching a shameless piece of war exploitation as its main storyline. That contrast tells you everything you need to know about the difference between great wrestling storytelling and cheap heat. The Savage and Elizabeth moment did not need a real war. It did not need a dead soldier or a terrorist threat or a portrait of a dictator. It needed years of honest character work and two performers who trusted the audience to feel something real. The Hogan and Slaughter main event needed all of the ugliness of the real world to generate any reaction at all. And even then, by the time the show aired, it felt hollow. Because Operation Desert Storm had ended about 6 weeks before WrestleMania, the war the entire main event had been built around was effectively over. The national energy had shifted from fear and anger to quiet relief. Families were waiting for their loved ones to come home. The moment that Vince had been building toward had already passed. The Hulk Hogan victory, which was supposed to feel like a cathartic national celebration, instead felt dated. It felt like arriving at a party the day after everyone had gone home. The numbers confirm what the storytelling already showed. The Saturday night's main event on NBC that aired as a lead-in to WrestleMania drew the lowest ratings in the history of that program on that network. Fans were tuning out. The Slaughter storyline was not just failing to attract new viewers, it was actively driving existing fans away. And then, later that same year, SummerSlam outperformed WrestleMania on buy rate. SummerSlam, the show that was supposed to be a distant second on the annual calendar, beat the flagship event because the Slaughter angle was finally cooling down. The WWF tried to keep it going for a few more months anyway. They brought in the Iron Sheik under the name Colonel Mustafa, paired him with Slaughter and Adnan, called them the Triangle of Terror, and ran a handicap match at SummerSlam where Hogan and Warrior teamed up to beat all three of them. And then, very quickly, the entire angle was dropped. Slaughter started filming vignettes at American landmarks, saying he wanted his country back, that he had made mistakes, that he loved America again. The whole thing was gone almost as fast as it arrived. Think about what that means. The WWF had put a real man through daily death threats, FBI security, bulletproof vests, and family trauma. They had exploited the deaths of real soldiers and the fears of real families. They had lied to the public about terrorist threats to cover for their own failure to sell tickets. And when it was no longer useful, they dropped the entire story and moved on like none of it had happened. The patriotism that Vince had presented as a matter of life and death turned out to be completely disposable the moment the business case disappeared. That is the real dark truth of WrestleMania 7. Not just one bad creative decision, not just one lie. It was a system of choices, each one prioritizing profit over people, that exposed the real values driving the company at the time. But here is the thing about WrestleMania 7. It also gave us Randy Savage and Miss Elizabeth. It gave us one of the most emotionally honest moments in the history of the medium. It showed that when wrestling trusts its audience, when it builds real stories with real stakes that do not require borrowing pain from the real world, it can do something no other form of entertainment can match. Fans rejected the cheap version. They pushed back with their wallets and their remote controls. And the industry eventually had to listen. The disaster was not a terrorist attack. It was a loss of audience trust. And trust, once lost, takes a lot more than a vignette at a national monument to earn back. Drop your thoughts in the comments. If this story hit different for you, leave a like. And if you want more deep dives into the history of wrestling that nobody talks about, make sure you are subscribed.
It was not Dave's fault. That was on me. It's my fault. I can't flip backwards.
No.
It's totally my fault.
But it was the next day And I got to the building, and somebody immediately said, Vince wants to see you in his office. And I was like, here it comes. And I walk into his office, and he's sitting, he's got his crutches beside him, he's all bandaged up. And he walks in, and he just starts laughing. And he's laughing at the top of his lungs, ha, 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 ha. And I was like, you're not gonna fire me? And he goes, no, I loved it. It was real. It was so great, and it was real, and nobody would know what was gonna happen, but he loved it.
Vince was furious. And before everything went sideways, before the chaos and the injuries and the screaming and earpieces, there was something genuinely exciting about this night. The Save Mart Center in Fresno, California was packed. The crowd was loud. The energy was electric. January 30th, 2005 was supposed to be the night WWE handed its future to two young stars and walked away clean. Everything was mapped out to the last second. Every moment had been planned, rehearsed, and approved. This was supposed to be a flawless coronation. Instead, it became one of the most brutal and chaotic nights in wrestling history. If you are into these real, behind-the-curtain wrestling stories, hit the hype feature and give this video some hype so more fans can find it. Here is the dark truth behind Royal Rumble 2005. A night where corporate rigidity, a total failure of planning, and one man's refusal to accept his own physical limits turned a scripted handoff into a live emergency broadcast. To understand exactly how it all unraveled, we are counting down the 5 key players who either caused the collapse, lived through it, or in one extraordinary case, physically destroyed themselves trying to stop it. We go from number 5 all the way down to number 1. And trust us, by the time we get to number 1, your jaw will be on the floor. Number 5, the machine that could not bend. Long before a single wrestler stepped through that curtain in Fresno, the pressure inside WWE was already immense. This was the brand extension era. Raw and SmackDown operated as 2 separate programs with their own rosters, their own general managers, their own referees, and their own culture. Most of the time, they did not even interact. The Royal Rumble was the one night per year where those 2 worlds collided in the same ring, and that made the stakes enormous. The industry was changing. The names that had built WWE into a global phenomenon, the Rocks and the Stone Colds of the world, were stepping aside. The company needed new stars at the top, not next year, now. The 2005 Royal Rumble was supposed to be the night that transition happened officially. Batista, the powerhouse of the Evolution stable, was positioned to win the match in headline WrestleMania 21 against Triple H. At the same time, John Cena, known to fans as the Doctor of Thugonomics, was set to begin a parallel rise on SmackDown. 2 brands, 2 new faces, 1 perfect night. The problem was that this machine was built on control, on precision, on every single part doing exactly what it was supposed to do at exactly the right moment with 0 deviation. The brand split had created walls between the 2 shows. Referees followed brand-specific rules. Producers communicated in their own channels. Authority figures operated in their own bubble. There was enormous pressure to execute without error, but almost no infrastructure in place to handle it if something went wrong. Think about what that actually means on a practical level. You have 2 rosters who barely interact. You have 2 sets of officials trained in slightly different ways. You have communication channels that run parallel rather than together. And you have a live television window that does not stop for anyone. If the show hits a wall, there is no pause button. There is no timeout. The broadcast keeps going regardless of what is happening behind the curtain. The plan was ironclad, and ironclad things shatter when they hit the floor. Number 4, the 1 in a million botch. The scripted finish for the Royal Rumble was clean and simple. After nearly an hour of action and 30 participants, only Batista and John Cena would remain. Batista would attempt his signature finishing move, the Batista Bomb. Cena would try to fight out of it. Batista would overpower him, throw him over the top rope, and stand alone in the ring as the winner of the 2005 Royal Rumble. Simple, dominant, exactly the image WWE wanted to project. What actually happened was something else entirely. Batista had scored 6 eliminations throughout the match. By the time he and Cena were the last two men standing, his body was running on empty. He was visibly exhausted, breathing hard. When he lifted Cena up for what was supposed to be the final elimination of the night, his center of gravity shifted at exactly the wrong moment. He lost his footing. His grip on the top rope gave out. Instead of staying in the ring after launching Cena over the side, Batista's own momentum pulled him backwards. Cena's weight, combined with what may have been a hard shot Batista took earlier in the exchange, carried both men toward the ropes together. They went over as one. Both men hit the floor at the exact same millisecond. Frame-by-frame analysis of the footage confirms it. The timing was so precise that it would have been nearly impossible to rehearse. 1 second the coronation was happening. The next, it was gone. There was no winner. There was no clean moment. There was just stunned silence. Two exhausted men outside the ring, and millions of fans watching at home, wondering if this was planned. John Cena later took responsibility for the incident publicly, saying he may have pushed into the lift more aggressively than needed, which contributed to the loss of balance. But in that moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was that the most important match of the year had just ended in a way nobody had accounted for. And behind the curtain, the people whose job it was to fix exactly this kind of situation were discovering something horrifying. They had no fix. Number 3. The empty seats behind the curtain. When something goes wrong during a live wrestling broadcast, WWE has a system for handling it. If the referees in the ring cannot sort out a disputed decision on their own, the solution is simple. You send out the on-screen authority figures, the general managers, to come down to the ring. They address the situation through dialogue. They keep the crowd engaged and give the appearance of order, while the producers in the back scramble to figure out a new finish and relay it to the referees through their earpieces. It buys time. It keeps the story moving. It is the standard procedure for exactly this kind of moment. On this night, there was just one problem. Eric Bischoff, the general manager of Raw, had already left the building. Teddy Long, the general manager of SmackDown, had already left the building. Both of them had finished their segments earlier in the night, assumed their work was done, and headed back to their hotels. Nobody had told them to stay. With both general managers gone, there was a vacuum. No one with on-screen authority could come out to resolve the dispute. Referees Jack Doan and Charles Robinson were standing on opposite sides of the argument, each acting on their own brand's training, each pointing to their man as the winner. In their earpieces, they were receiving conflicting instructions from producers in the gorilla position, who were themselves scrambling for answers. The crowd was growing restless. The television window was closing, and nobody in charge had a solution. This is the part that never gets talked about enough. Two of the most important people for handling exactly this type of situation had simply walked out of the arena. Not because they were unprofessional, but because a culture of siloed communication meant no one had thought to keep them on standby. No one had said, "Stay close tonight just in case." That one missing instruction, that one simple conversation that never happened, is what opened the door for everything that followed. The machine had no contingency plan because the machine had never considered needing one. Failure was not in the script. And now that failure had arrived, the absence of those two general managers had left a gaping hole in the only real solution. Somebody needed to come out and take control of this situation, and there was exactly one person left who was willing to do that. Number 2, the panic behind the curtain. The gorilla position is the staging area directly behind the entrance curtain. It is where the show's producers stand and manage everything during a live event. They watch the monitors. They talk to the referees. They coordinate every second of the broadcast in real time. On a normal night, this is a calm and professional operation. Nothing gets done on a WWE broadcast without it passing through the gorilla position. On this night, it had fallen apart completely. Bruce Pritchard and Pat Patterson were watching the monitors and trying to figure out what to do. Every second that passed without a resolution was another second of confusion going out live to the audience. They were firing instructions through earpieces to referees who were already arguing with each other. Nobody could agree on a finish because nobody had been given one yet. The script had ended, the GMs were gone, the crowd was confused, and the producers, two of the most experienced men in the business, were in a full tailspin. Vince McMahon was standing in the gorilla position watching all of it. He had not come down there intending to go anywhere. He was there to oversee, but what he saw in those monitors, his machine failing on live television, his referees bickering, his producers panicking, his carefully built night collapsing in real time was more than he could stand to watch. His face went red, his voice went sharp, and something shifted in him that turned a passive observer into a man who was about to do something that made the situation significantly worse in the short term and legendary in the long term. Vince McMahon stepped through the curtain. Number 1, the boss who broke himself. He came down that ramp like a man on fire. 59 years old, no warm-up, cold muscles that had not been stretched or prepared for anything physical. He was running entirely on adrenaline and fury, and he was moving fast. To the fans in Fresno, this probably looked like another dramatic Vince McMahon entrance. The chairman showing up to sort out the mess his superstars had made. Business as usual. It was not business as usual. When he reached the ring, Vince did not slow down. He dropped into a slide under the bottom rope, a move he had performed hundreds of times in his life. The moment his knees made contact with the edge of the apron, the impact was catastrophic. The sudden, explosive force traveled straight through his quadriceps tendons. His right quad tore, completely, gone in a single moment of contact. People standing near the ring heard the sound. Vince felt it too, but he was so flooded with adrenaline, so driven by the need to control what was happening in that ring, that he refused to acknowledge it. Instead, he tried to stand. He pushed down with everything he had, trying to rise to his feet and take charge of the situation. That effort tore his left quad as well. Both quadriceps tendons severed, both legs useless. The mechanism that allows a human being to stand and walk, gone in a matter of seconds. Vince McMahon, the man who had built WWE with sheer willpower and an iron refusal to show weakness, could not get up off the floor of his own ring. He did not scream. He did not grab at his legs. He did not show the pain on his face, at least not in the way you would expect. He simply fell back onto the canvas and sat there, leaning against the ropes, staring out at the ring from the mat. From where the fans were sitting, it looked like a power move. It looked like the Mad King was so disgusted with what had happened that he refused to dignify the moment by standing. A character beat, a choice. It was not a choice. He physically could not move. And yet, from that position, Vince McMahon ran the match. He growled at the referees from the canvas, his voice somewhere between agony and executive command. He demanded they restart. The producers in the back relayed the same message through the earpieces. The referees, terrified of getting it wrong and terrified of the man sitting in front of them, received the order from two directions simultaneously. Batista stood nearby, fully convinced he was about to be fired. Cena waited for instruction. The audience held its breath, and the chairman of WWE, unable to stand, unable to walk, and running on nothing but ego and adrenaline, called the shot from the mat. The match restarted. Batista hit a spinebuster. He eliminated Cena. He was declared the winner. Pyro finally erupted, late and rushed, but it came. The coronation had happened. Not the way anyone planned, not the way anyone rehearsed, not on schedule, and not with any dignity, but it happened. Then came the most extraordinary exit in wrestling history. Vince McMahon refused a stretcher. He refused all help. Driven by the same pride that had made him run down that ramp in the first place, he insisted on leaving the ring under his own power. He rolled out. He dragged himself toward the back. His knees could not lock. His legs had nothing left in them. He used the hallway walls for support, shouting at medical staff to stay back, refusing to let anyone see him as anything other than the man in charge. The second he passed through the gorilla position curtain and was out of public view, he collapsed. He was rushed immediately for emergency surgery. The recovery took the better part of a year. Now here's the part that changes everything. Days after Royal Rumble 2005, Batista was called into Vince McMahon's office. He walked in, expecting to be terminated. What he found was McMahon on crutches, laughing about the whole thing. Vince loved it. He believed the chaos, the tie, the confusion, the restart, all of it had generated more genuine excitement and buzz than any scripted finish ever could have. And in the long run, he was not wrong about that. The confusion of the tie actually helped build Batista and Cena as equals in the eyes of the audience. It made them look like two men on the exact same level heading into their respective title runs at WrestleMania 21. That accidental shared history between them would eventually lead to a headline match at WrestleMania 26, 5 years later. a match that many fans believe would not have carried nearly the same weight without what happened on this night in Fresno. The show survived. The moment became legendary. Both men became generational stars. But the dark truth of Royal Rumble 2005 is what it revealed beneath the surface. A machine so rigid it had no room for error, general managers who left early because nobody told them to stay, producers with no backup plan, a culture so locked into the idea of never showing weakness that the chairman of the company tore both his legs rather than accept help. The botch became a blessing, yes, but only because they were lucky enough for both men to hit the floor at the exact same second. 1 millisecond either way, and the whole story ends differently. No legendary restart, no shared history, just a messy finish nobody remembers. The show must go on. That is the philosophy. Always has been in every era of this business. But sometimes the show surviving has a cost that the cameras never quite capture and the highlight reels never show. If you enjoyed this one, drop a comment below and tell us which part of this night shocked you the most. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and we will see you in the next one.